Hi, my name is Evanna, and I just want to give you like a 1-minute spiel about what I do just to set up sort of the framework for what I want to talk about. So I'm a technologist, successful entrepreneur, working primarily in the Middle East and Africa. But on the side, I've also done a lot of consulting for various donor agencies as well as local governments on how to develop the private sector with a focus on entrepreneurial ecosystem. And a lot of this work has been in the Levant region as well as in Afghanistan. So this is quite a controversial topic that I want to talk to you about, which is stop trying to be the next Silicon Valley. If you open up any newspapers from the Wall Street Journal to Al Arabia or any of the international newspapers, you see this headline that says, will Singapore be the next Silicon Valley of Asia, or will Dubai be the next Silicon Oasis? Although Silicon Oasis is also the term that's being used for the tech startup scene in Israel and also in Jordan. So even the naming is becoming really, really repetitive. But that's sort of just the top layer. So my thesis is that there are too many cities, locales, and national governments are trying to emulate Silicon Valley, but it's honestly a waste of time, energy, and resources. And I will tell you how we should actually talk about and think about the establishment of innovation communities for entrepreneurial ecosystems. Right. So from Silicon Beach, which is in LA, to Silicon Oasis in Dubai, to Singapore, Silicon Valley of Asia. Apparently they don't have a name for it. We hear about this just so often, right? And it makes a lot of sense because governments ultimately want to drive the economy forward. And if you want to drive the economy forward, you have to innovate. You have to give people the ability, you have to give them the tools, and you have to empower them to innovate. And they're really trying to solve 3 problems. So the first is the youth unemployment, underemployment, restlessness, et cetera, because ultimately that does lead to national security issues. And the second is really to advance the R&D sector in their country. If you don't really have technology, you can't really be building the fastest submarine, right, for national defense. And the third is really to diversify the economy. So this cartoon is actually in one of the Chinese newspapers, and that's Putin trying to save his oil industry. And I'm sure this resonates a lot in the Middle East, especially with what's going on in the GCC. So this is one trend, right? At the same time, Silicon Valley itself has become really good at marketing. It is a brand of its own. And when people think about Silicon Valley, they have basically positioned themselves to be seen as the next savior of the economy, the next savior of the nation, and the next savior of humanity. I don't know how many of you guys watch Silicon Valley, the TV show, but this is, which basically makes fun of Silicon Valley. And this one, it says Pied Piper, which is a product there, and it says helping humanity thrive, right? And so we see all of this, and we understand the power of Silicon Valley because ultimately the products that have come from there have changed the way that we consume information, the way we even behave, the way we process information. And that's why it's very critical that we understand that Silicon Valley itself, while it's fantastic and it's great, it was created at an unprecedented time in history, and that can't really be replicated. So putting together these 2 trends, we get, so this is what I was talking about. So I'm not sure how many of you guys actually know the history of Silicon Valley, but Silicon Valley was essentially started right after World War II and was created by a bunch of guys in Washington, D.C. who said, we're really scared. There's this really big country over here called the Soviet Union. We don't know where it's going. Europe is in shambles. And we really want to make sure that the U.S. is ahead. And so DARPA, which is the R&D arm of the Department of Defense, poured in tons of money into Silicon Valley. And that's where we get GPS on our phones. And that's where we get a lot of the consumer products. And ultimately, they actually had this uncanny collaboration unheard of at the time with the private sector, not just the creatives who tend to get dismissed by people in Washington. But they've also connected it to the private sector, to the banking industry, and et cetera. So it's sort of this like hodgepodge of people who decided, hey, we can actually push this forward, and at the same time, we can make a lot of money, we can have a lot of impact, right? Okay. But Silicon Valley is sort of like unicorn. I'm sure we've heard about this term a lot, and there was a panel about it yesterday, and we're talking about Uber as the unicorn. But Silicon Valley is actually like the mother of all unicorns, which means that basically you can't really replicate it. You can't replicate every single individual ingredients that went into it, not even mentioning luck, right? And so, why do governments still try to do this? I think a part of it is PR, but most importantly, it sounds really good. It gets a lot of the donor money. And so in order for this to change, we need to change the mindset of a lot of the funding organizations, a lot of the people in the US, a lot of people in the EU. But what's more interesting is that by trying to emulate Silicon Valley, there's actually a backlash against it, because Silicon Valley in the States is not this glamorous thing where everyone's flocking to. Yes, there are people doing it, but at the same time, what we don't hear about are the riots that are happening on the streets of San Francisco, because the residents there can no longer afford the city that they've lived in for generations. People have tried to physically stop the Google buses from going to work because they literally cannot pay for their children's food and education. And so there's a huge elitist component to Silicon Valley, and that's why it's being satirized so much in American culture. But for some reason, that message has sort of gotten lost as it has been translated across from culture to culture. At the same time, Silicon Valley is not very inclusive. I was just on a panel about women in tech. It is a lot of bros in their 20s wearing hoodies and being white male. And putting that in the context of the Middle East, if you think about it, the people who actually have access to technology on a regular basis, who can afford the coding and all that stuff, they tend to be coming from the middle class or the upper class. So you're missing this whole entire 70% of the population who simply just don't have access. So what do you do about them, right? And that's why you get this sort of widening gap between the rich and the poor, which has created some problems in this region. All right, so how to build your own and better version of Silicon Valley. Just to know about this is I was asked to speak about sort of the macro level, like saying, hey, look at all the regions in the world and give us some key takeaways. And that's really, really hard because every single place is different. It has its own, and it has its own context. So I try really hard to pick out stuff that's actually interesting. All right, so I think when Gary did his presentation earlier today, he talked about the 7 pillars of influence in the city. And this is sort of like the collaboration that I was talking about earlier that needs to happen, that doesn't. Because a lot of times industries are very siloed within themselves, right? So you have government, and within government you have the diplomacy folks, you have the defense folks, et cetera. You need family or values, business, media, education, religion, or some kind of a worldview. And the arts and entertainment. I need all these people to be able to play nice with each other, which is becoming very difficult. Secondly is embrace your uniqueness. It's totally fine to say, hey, I'm Afghanistan. It makes no sense for me to have a tech startup scene here, even though there are 6 incubators in Kabul, because we don't have 3G. And 97% of people don't have access to the internet. So why are we trying to build a tech startup scene? And this is something I said to the president a couple months ago, and he was like, you know what? I never really thought about it, but I got all these donors who are coming in and saying, build a tech thing. And so I'm gonna do it because at least that will temporarily employ some of my people. Well, I mean, that's lovely and great for the 1 year that you have the grant for, but after that, you're kind of back to square one. So you have to embrace it. So I made a suggestion to him, instead of looking at just technology, why don't you look at agriculture? right? Afghanistan exports a lot of their agriculture to Pakistan, to India, et cetera. Why not look at that and see what skills farmers are lacking in terms of access to the marketplace and skills to be able to actually have their own family businesses? All right, so diversify the industries. I think Silicon Valley also has given this connotation, has changed the definition of technology to basically almost saying it's software. The hardware movement is growing, but it's not very big right now. And so when you're thinking about this, it's once again, you have to think about the context that you're in and saying, okay, I'm really good at this and this and this, and so this is what I want to focus on. And at the same time, I think I have a comparative advantage in these industries I'm not so great on, but I want to improve. And that's for the long-term game, and that's very difficult in this political situation, but a couple countries have done it. All right, and this is sort of the same thing. Play your strength and know your weaknesses. And so this is more of a geopolitical strategy game that you sort of have to play in thinking about how to build the next entrepreneurial ecosystem. Is you might not be so great at one thing internationally, but you're really good at it within your region, so how can you fix that? So right now there's a delegation where there's an opening of CASA 1000, which is this new electricity project, and they're actually importing solar electricity from Tajikistan into Pakistan. And when we think about Tajikistan, we're like, well, first of all, where is it? And secondly, like, never heard that country before. It's a really poor country. But that's something that they're really good at. They're horrible at it if you look at it from the international perspective, but they're really good when compared to Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Kazakhstan, right? All right, so we involve everyone. We should all be like these furry animals and play nice with each other. That's much easier said than done. There's a lot of ego. There's a lot of long-term feud that we actually need to get over. But if you really want to create the next entrepreneurial ecosystem, this is what you actually ultimately have to do. All right, so that's super quick. I want to open it for Q&A instead of just me here talking about my own opinions.
How is the community different in Kabul than it is here? You Egyptians, somebody's got to start first. So, and everybody's going to open up. If you want a big family, those chickens.
Perhaps you can maybe expand on, based on your research and experience, if you look at the context of developing countries versus Silicon Valley or sort of Western model, what similarities and differences do you see that are organic to those sort of things?
I think the biggest difference is culture. In Silicon Valley, in the US, it might not be really cool to be nerdy when you're like in high school, but it's really cool to be nerdy when you're older. Because then you can be creating a lot of really cool stuff, right? And you don't need to depend, you can code yourself or do whatever and sort of break that mold. There's also this more of an acceptance to fail. And that's something that's very different here. But on a much more of a macro level as well, I think governments here don't have the bargain power that they do with in developed countries because they rely very heavily on stakeholders and shareholders whose missions are a lot more short term. And so they end up doing stuff just because they sort of have to in order to get another thing done, right? And so then you're now thinking like, okay, am I actually a pawn? Like, what is going on, and how can I actually break out of it? Because I do believe, and this also gets to the second point, which is that I think developing countries, their government's self-interests are not really aligned in terms with. There are some really good politicians, but there's some really bad ones too. And ultimately, you want what's the best for the people. And I don't think that's actually happening a lot in developing countries.
So you're thinking that create something, I'm not going to say yes, I don't
Yeah, of course, yeah. I do believe that we need to start from the grassroots, from bottom up, but at the same time, I also fully recognize that once you get to a certain level, you can't really fly under the radar, right? So then you gotta pay your taxes, you gotta do all these business regulations, and that's controlled by the government. So you do ultimately still have to be aligned. You have to be able to be aware of what's going on the government level.
problem, I think, in Egypt, and more specifically in Egypt, the government don't understand clearly what an entrepreneur needs approach. So usually the problem is they need a lot. For instance, if you'd like to establish a company, it takes you a process that makes you, instead of focusing when you're building your customer, you're focusing on other hassles that's related to the government. So
Yeah.
it's really
I mean, I do think you need the buy-in of the government if you want to do it, but at the same time, I've also seen a few other places where they just got a bunch of people together and they just did it and they had to sway the government. Because the government is always the lagging indicator, right? But there is a very fine line, especially in a place like Egypt or in a lot of the countries in the Middle East where you can't track them too far out or else they're going to become too scared. Yeah, yeah. Did you have?
Everyone is trying to mimic Silicon Valley, but will it still be successful, let's say, in 50 more years, if we remain successful and continue to have a lot of things to be done and new technology and so on, or somehow it will fail at the end like everything?
So I believe that history goes in cycles. So you have the boom and you have the bust. And I think you're already starting to see a lot of the bubble, sort of like people saying like, well, actually Silicon Valley isn't that great because of X, Y, and Z. I think people are starting to notice that. But I think it's still gonna, I mean, we're not gonna have another like .com boom until like, or .com bust until, I think for another maybe decade. But in 50 years, I think it'll be very different because just also because of the main players in Silicon Valley right now, a lot of them are not very happy with where it has gone. And a lot of the money from DARPA, for example, essentially has been absorbed within the Department of Defense and things like that. So I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's probably, I guess you're going this way. This is present, right? And this is the future. It's probably still going to go up by a little bit, and then it's going to start dropping down. That's my opinion. And also, yeah. Thank you.